The December wind cut through Nebraska territory like a knife, carrying ice that bit into the skin until it burned. Martha Henley pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, but it did little against the cold that had already seeped into her bones. Her boots, worn thin at the soles, crunched through the frozen mud as she approached the ranch house, a long, low building that seemed to crouch against the wind like an old animal trying to survive another winter. She'd walked 8 miles from the stage stop, following directions given by a merchant who had looked at her with a mix of pity and suspicion. The Garrison Ranch, he'd said, might need help. That word might was all she had to hold on to. It had been enough to keep her walking, even as hunger gnawed at her belly and doubt whispered that she was chasing ghosts. When she reached the yard, Martha stopped to take in the sight. The ranch was rough but solid, strong fences stretching toward the gray horizon, a barn standing firm against the wind. But something felt wrong. The porch steps were half buried in tumbleweeds, and the windows, bare of curtains, stared back at her like hollow eyes. This was a place that had known loss. Her first knock was so weak the wind almost carried it away. The second came louder, echoing against the wooden door like a hollow warning. For a moment, there was no sound but the groan of the wind and the creak of the barn in the distance. Then the door opened suddenly, and a man filled the frame. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face carved by years of sun and struggle, gray eyes as cold as the winter sky met hers. "We don't need nothin'," he said gruffly, already half turning to close the door. "Wait," Martha blurted, the desperation in her voice sharper than she meant. She straightened her back, trying to gather what little pride she had left. "I heard you might need help. I can cook, clean, mend. I've worked cattle too, if need be." The man's gaze moved over her, her patched dress, her chapped hands, the weariness etched into her face. Martha held still, though shame burned in her cheeks. She knew what he saw. A woman of 32 who looked closer to 40, her hair dulled, her figure thinned by hunger and hard luck. "Can't pay wages," he said flatly, barely keeping the place running as is. "Room and board would do," she replied before she could stop herself. "Just through winter. I'll earn my keep." He studied her in silence. Then something shifted in his eyes. Not softness exactly, but recognition. Like two wounded creatures recognizing the same pain. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost a growl. "Only job here is wife in my bed." The words hit her like a slap. Martha's breath caught, heat rushed to her face despite the cold. "I'm not that kind of woman," she said quietly, though her voice trembled. "Didn't say you were," he replied. His tone held no mockery, no lust, just plain, tired truth. "Got a boy that needs raising. House needs tending. Man needs a wife for those things. Not a hired girl who'll leave come spring." She blinked at him, confusion mixing with anger. "That's not marriage," she said bitterly. "Marriage is an arrangement," he said. "Most folks just dress it up prettier. I don't have time for that. You need a home. I need someone who will stay." She should have turned around right then, but her last coin had bought the stage fare, and her stomach had been empty for 2 days. And somewhere behind this hard man was a child, a boy without a mother. "Your wife?" she asked softly. "Fever took her last spring," he said, his voice flat but heavy. Boy hasn't spoken since. Something inside Martha cracked at that. She knew the silence of grief, the kind that choked the voice right out of a person. She'd lived it when they brought her husband's body home from the cattle drive, his face crushed beyond recognition. "I'll meet the boy first," she said. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in from the cold. Won't solve anything freezing on my porch." Martha stepped inside. The warmth was faint, but it wrapped around her like mercy. The house smelled of coffee and dust. Dishes were stacked on the counter. Floors swept but not clean. Furniture plain and worn. "Coffee?" he asked, moving to the stove. "Thank you," she said, taking the chipped cup he handed her. The liquid was bitter enough to sting her eyes, but it thawed her insides. "The boy, Ben," he said. "He's in his room mostly. Spends his time there since she passed." She nodded, glancing toward the narrow hallway. "My name is Martha Henley." "Thomas Garrison," he replied. "Most call me Tom." They stood in uneasy silence, two strangers who had just discussed marriage like a business deal. Then, movement in the doorway caught her eye, a small figure, half hidden in shadow. The boy couldn't have been more than 6. He had his father's dark hair but softer features, and eyes too old for his face. He stared at her without blinking. "Ben," Tom said, his voice gentling in a way that surprised her. "This is Mrs. Henley." The child didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. Martha crouched down slowly until she was level with him. She didn't reach out or speak, just waited, letting him decide. The boy studied her for what felt like forever. Then, from behind his back, he brought out a small, carved horse, its paint worn away. He held it out, not giving it, just showing it. "That's a fine horse," Martha said softly. "Does he have a name?" The boy's lips moved soundlessly. It wasn't speech, but it was effort. The spark of something trying to live again. Tom's rough voice broke the silence. "He don't talk. Not for months." Martha stood, looking at Tom. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something beneath the hard exterior. Pain, guilt, loneliness. "The offer stands," he said. "Marriage in name and duty, roof over your head, food in your belly, respect in my house. I won't promise love, but I won't raise a hand to you neither. You'll have say in the household. The boy needs a mother's touch. I need—" He hesitated, jaw tight. "I need this place to feel alive again." Through the window, Martha saw the last light fade over the frozen prairie. Out there lay hunger and cold. In here stood survival. And, maybe, something worth saving. "I'll stay the night," she said. "We'll see come morning." Tom nodded once. "Fair enough." As he turned to stoke the fire, Martha glanced toward the boy. Ben still watched her. The carved horse clutched to his chest. His eyes, wide and searching, seemed to ask the same question that trembled inside her heart. Would she stay? Outside, the wind howled against the walls, but for the first time in a long time, Martha wasn't facing it alone. Morning came gray and slow, the kind that seemed to hesitate before breaking the cold grip of night. Frost rimmed the window panes, and Martha woke stiff from the narrow cot Tom had given her in what used to be the sewing room. Her hands were numb, but she'd slept, truly slept, for the first time in weeks. When she entered the kitchen, Tom was already there. A pot of coffee steamed on the stove, and ledgers were spread out before him. He glanced up briefly, then back to his numbers. "Coffee's hot," he said. Martha poured herself a cup. "I meant what I said last night," he began, eyes still on the ledger. "But I'll make it plainer. This ranch is hanging by a thread. Lost half the herd to disease last summer. Right after," his jaw tightened, "right after Mary died. What I'm offering ain't comfort. It's survival." Martha took a slow sip, the bitterness biting her tongue. "You could hire help come spring," she said carefully. "Help don't stay," he said. "They don't fix what's broke. They don't make a boy smile again, or know where his mother kept the good tablecloth. I don't need hired hands. I need a wife." "You want a replacement," she said, sharper than intended. He met her gaze, steady. "No, I can't replace her. Any more than you can replace the man you lost." Her breath caught. He didn't know her story, but somehow he'd seen it written in her face. Tom looked away, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "I need someone to share the load. You'd have say in household matters. I won't pretend there's love in it, but there'll be respect. You'd be mistress of this house, mother to my son, wife-in-law, if not in other ways." Martha studied him. He was a hard man, but not cruel. Honest, maybe to a fault. "You're very plain-spoken," she said. "Saves time," he replied. They fell into silence, broken only by the hiss of the stove. Finally, Martha spoke. "And the boy? What if he doesn't want another woman here? What if he can't?" Tom's expression softened. "You reached him yesterday. First time he's come out of that room for a stranger since Mary passed. Showed you his horse. That's more than he's shown anyone in months." Martha glanced toward the hallway. "That's not acceptance," she murmured. "It's a start," he said quietly. The door creaked then, and Ben appeared. His small feet were bare against the cold floor. He looked between them, sensing the weight in the room, then crossed to Martha's side and stood close enough for her to feel the warmth of his shoulder. Tom froze, his coffee halfway to his lips. "He ain't done that not since she died," he said softly. Martha didn't move, afraid to break the fragile trust. She simply laid her hand on the table, open and still. The boy hesitated, then placed his wooden horse beside it. Not in her palm, just close enough to mean something. Tom's voice came low. "That's your answer, Mrs. Henley." She looked down at the boy, then back at Tom. "If I agree," she said, "there'll be conditions." Tom nodded once. "Fair enough. First, I'll need a proper bedroom. The sewing room's too cold." "You'd have the main one," he said. "I'll take the small room." That surprised her, but she went on. "Second, I'll need say in household matters. If I'm to be your partner, not your servant." "You'll have it," he said. "Household's yours. Books stay open to you." "And third," she added, "about Ben. I won't force him to call me anything he's not ready for. He sets the pace." Tom nodded again. "Fair." She hesitated. "And if he never speaks again?" "Then we live with it," he said simply. "We'll have tried." Martha's resolve faltered. The offer was harsh but honest. There was no charm, no pretense. Just survival and a strange kind of hope. "When?" she asked finally. "Circuit preacher comes next week," Tom said. "Or we could ride to town and see Judge Harper sooner." "Next week," she said, "gives us time to adjust." Quote, Tom rose from his chair. "You can start putting the house to rights. Use whatever you need." He took a leather pouch from his pocket and set it on the table. "What's there is for the household. You'll find fabric, food, whatever the boy needs." Martha stared at the small pouch, trust made visible. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'll be in the barn," he muttered, then left. The door closed behind him, and the silence that followed felt alive. Ben tugged at her sleeve and pointed toward the cupboard. "Breakfast?" she guessed. The boy nodded, the barest smile tugging at his mouth. Together they searched the shelves, his gestures guiding her through the kitchen's secrets. It became a wordless dance, the child pointing, she following, filling the silence with gentle chatter about the weather, about pancakes, about nothing at all. When Tom returned at noon, the smell of flapjacks and coffee filled the air. Martha stood at the stove. Ben beside her dusted with flour, his cheeks pink from the heat. The boy looked up when his father entered and smiled. It was small, tentative, but real. Tom stopped in the doorway, as if afraid to breathe. "Smells good," he said finally. Ben looked up at him again, eyes bright. And in that moment, Tom Garrison's hardened expression cracked just enough for Martha to glimpse the man beneath. The one who'd loved deeply, lost terribly, and didn't yet know how to live again. They ate together, quietly but comfortably. Three souls bound by necessity, and something gentler beginning to stir beneath it. When Ben giggled, just once, soft and fleeting, Martha met Tom's eyes across the table. He didn't smile, not quite, but she saw it there, waiting. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and steady, and for the first time in many months, the Garrison Ranch felt almost like a home. The next morning dawned bright and bitter cold. Sunlight spilled across the snow, turning it to fields of glittering white. Martha stood at the window, watching Tom limp toward the barn, his breath a pale cloud in the frigid air. She'd been there only a few weeks, yet it already felt like years. Days measured in chores, in small kindnesses, in the slow stitching together of broken things. She had come to this ranch with nothing but her name and a stubborn will to survive. Now there was warmth in the house again, bread baked in the mornings. Laughter sometimes, quiet and uncertain, but laughter all the same. Ben had started humming when he played, small, wordless tunes that filled the silence where grief used to live. But peace on the frontier never lasted long. That February morning, Tom didn't return from the barn when he should have. The wind had picked up, heavy with snow, and by noon it had turned into a full blizzard, the kind that could bury a man alive. Martha paced the kitchen, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. "Ben," she said, forcing calm into her voice, "he's probably taking shelter. He knows these storms." But the boy's eyes were wide with fear. He fetched his father's spare coat and pushed it toward her, shaking his head fiercely, pointing toward the window. Martha hesitated only a moment. "Stay here," she told him, tying a rope around her waist and fastening the other end of the porch post. "If I'm not back soon, you ring that bell until someone hears. You understand?" Ben's small chin lifted, wet eyes shining with tears. She kissed his forehead and stepped into the storm. The cold hit her like a wall, biting through layers of wool and resolve. Snow blinded her. The wind screamed. She followed the rope fence, one frozen step at a time, calling Tom's name though the wind snatched her words away. She found him near the feed shed, half buried, his horse standing guard. His face was gray, his leg twisted unnaturally. "Tom!" she cried, dropping to her knees. His eyes fluttered open, dazed with pain. "Fool woman," he rasped. "Get back inside." "Not without you," she said, already assessing the damage. "Your leg's broken. Leave me. Not a chance." Using strength born of fear and fury, Martha hauled him up, slinging his arm over her shoulder. "Ben's waiting," she said through gritted teeth. "You want that boy to lose both his parents?" That reached him. Together, they stumbled toward the house, the storm clawing at them like a living thing. The distance felt endless. 10 feet, 20, 50. Each step was a victory. At last, the porch loomed out of the white haze. Ben flung open the door before they even reached it, his face pale with terror. Together they dragged Tom inside, collapsing in a heap near the fire. His skin was icy, his breath shallow. Martha cut away his boot, revealing a swollen, mangled leg. "It needs setting," he gasped. "I've done it before," she lied, recalling how she'd watched her late husband set a ranch hand's arm once. "Ben, fetch wood for splints." The boy moved like lightning, bringing what she needed. Martha worked quickly, her hands shaking but steady enough to do what had to be done. Tom bit down on a strip of leather, sweat mixing with snowmelt on his face. When she pulled the bone straight, his scream filled the house, echoing against the rafters before fading into unconsciousness. By the time she finished binding the leg, the fire had burned low. Martha and Ben worked together to drag his mattress near the stove. They covered him in every blanket they owned. The storm howled outside, but inside, the fight for life continued. Hours passed. Martha kept vigil, spooning warm broth between Tom's lips when he stirred. Ben curled up beside his father, his small hand resting over Tom's chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart. Near midnight, Tom's eyes opened. He looked at her. Really looked at her. "You're still here," he whispered. "Where else would I be?" she said. He managed a weak smile. "You could have let me freeze." "I could have," she said softly, wringing out a warm cloth to wipe his face. "But I didn't." "Why?" She hesitated, meeting his weary gaze. "Because the thought of losing you was worse than the storm." Something flickered in his eyes then, something she hadn't seen before. His hand, rough and trembling, found hers. His thumb brushed her wrist in a tender, clumsy gesture that said more than words ever could. For 3 long days the storm raged. They were trapped together, surviving on bread, broth, and stubborn will. Martha tended his wounds. Ben kept the fire alive, and the 3 of them formed something new, a bond forged by necessity, tempered by care. When the storm finally broke, sunlight poured through the window like forgiveness. Tom's fever had broken too. He sat propped on pillows, his voice still rough, but stronger. "You saved me," he said simply. Martha smiled faintly. "We saved each other." Tom's hand reached for hers again. "When I asked you to stay, I didn't know what kind of woman you were," he said. "Now I do." "And?" "You're the kind who turns a cold house into a home. The kind who'd walk into a blizzard for a man not worth saving. "You're wrong about that," she said, voice trembling. "You're worth it." They sat in silence, the fire crackling, Ben drawing pictures on the hearthstones with bits of charcoal. The boy looked up then, his face glowing with quiet pride. "Papa," he said suddenly. The word hung in the air. Tom froze, eyes wide. "What did you say?" Quote. Ben repeated, louder this time, voice steady. "Papa!" Martha's hand flew to her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Tom reached out with shaking fingers, pulling his son into his arms. The boy buried his face in his father's neck, and Tom's body shook with silent sobs. Martha turned away, giving them the moment that belonged to them both. She looked out the window where the storm had been and saw sunlight breaking across the frozen land. It was more than weather clearing. It was hearts thawing. Later that spring, when the preacher returned to the territory, Tom and Martha stood before him beneath the old cottonwood tree. Ben held the rings they'd made from iron nails, his small fingers steady. The preacher's voice was simple, solemn. "You've already been through the sickness and the storms. What remains is choice. Do you still choose each other?" Quote. "I do," Tom said. "I do," Martha echoed. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ben whooped so loudly that the ranch hands laughed. Tom leaned in, brushed a kiss against Martha's forehead, awkward and tender all at once. It wasn't the wild love she'd dreamed of in her youth, but it was steady, true, and earned. As the sun set over the wide Nebraska prairie, the three of them stood together, man, woman, and child, shadows stretching long against the land. Martha looked at the home behind them, at the life they'd built from loss and courage. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a widow or a wanderer. She was home. And when Tom's hand found hers, strong and sure, she squeezed it back, her heart full. Out on the wind, faint but clear, came the sound of Ben's laughter. The kind that carried far across the plains. The Garrison Ranch, once silent as a grave, was alive again. And Martha Henley, who'd knocked on a stranger's door one desperate winter night, had found far more than shelter. She'd found a family,